So, hello and good afternoon from a very, very foggy Edinburgh, Scotland. So, I've been on and off, was walking around the street. Now, it was meant to have cleared up by now, and it hasn't. But I had a very specific conversation I wanted to give today all the same. And so, I'm not going to try and give a full tour of Scotland's capital because that would be superfluous, as I have many friends who are actually expert guides here. But it is a place that many of you who know me and follow me are aware I'm familiar with the place. Now, I'm just seeing if I haven't seen. So hopefully everyone's able to chat and say hi because it's lovely to have you here. There we go. There we are. Hi there, right? Well, now when I replay these, you don't see people's names, but my friend Robert just signed on and I haven't seen you for ages, so it is lovely to see you here, my friend. And there's lovely Diane. So I know we'll see quite a crowd of people, but what I would like to talk about, and hi Jay, nice to see you too. So I'm gonna launch into the conversation of what I want to do. Now, I'm over in the new town of Edinburgh. So Edinburgh is about, hey Paula, friends from Ireland, I can just about stand on my toes and wave to you. I've done a little 1-minute video as well that isn't published yet, but it gets uploaded. I've been really worried that I wouldn't be able to hold the stream out here. And I mean that because the last time I tried to do a live video up in the old town, it just froze up after a few minutes. So I've come down to the new town. Now, the new town is still 300 years old. This is Scotland's capital, which is about 900 years old, also known as Dunedin. And there's a Dunedin down in the south of New Zealand. But obviously, most Scotland is, let's call it 5.5 million people. They say Glasgow's 600,000, but Greater Glasgow is really like 2 million. So it's the biggest city, and that's only an hour drive from here. So we're just in a port city in the Firth of Forth, of course. In fact, right down, let me turn this around here. That's cool. Dunedin down in Florida. I did not know that. But I'm out here by the Dundas statue, which I'd like to talk about. But if we got on one of these new tramways for about 3.5 kilometers, you would be down to the Royal Ship Britannia, and that's the old port of Leith, which is really part of Edinburgh now, but was separate at a different time. And that's where the port is. So there's a big inlet, and on the other side is over in Fife, or the Kingdom of Fife, and that's where St. Andrews is, the birth of golf. And I've done a couple of short little videos from there. I'd love to go do a live tour, but I didn't get there this time. Hey, Allison from Aberdeen, I know you were down. I know you're on tour as well, because I saw your post on Facebook. I would have loved to see you. I am just finishing up my tour here, so it's nice to connect. And obviously, I know all my friends who are professional guides in this country. I'm not trying to usurp their stories, rather give some promotion to this fascinating country. But I did think I would come right up here and just show you Henry Dundas, way up on the plinth. He died in 1811. Now, for any Canadians on board, Dundas is a really important name. There's Dundas Street right in Toronto. There's Dundas, Ontario, and there's Dundas Island out between Vancouver and Vancouver Island. Now, this was paid for by people from the Royal Navy, but he was a parliamentarian, and they called him the unofficial King of Scotland. All that noted, the British Empire stopped transporting enslaved people in 1807 and didn't really banish it till 1832. You might remember a tour I did in Falmouth, Jamaica, that talk a lot about that terrible crime against humanity. Well, Dundas, and it's coming out about him now, was actually, as a parliamentarian, someone who passed legislation to defer the abolition of enslavement. And in fact, a lot of the big buildings you get up here in the Edinburgh area, and also in beautiful Liverpool, go right back to that Atlantic slave trade. And by him deferring it, thousands more people, well, 500,000 they say, were actually transported from Africa. So right over here, there's a new panel, and they are replacing the explanation for him. So it's quite interesting. All that noted, this little metal pipe said to the tree, "Lean on me," which was lovely of it. Now, there's the light rail transit system, which is wonderful. Of course, those of us from my part of the world, both Calgary and Edmonton, have light rail as well. Ours is because we're so cold. And I'm just back behind, I think, the actual headquarters of the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is the National Westminster Bank down in England. So all that noted, really what I wanted to talk about today, so I want to keep showing you around, of course, but what I want to talk about is the fact that I finally got into the National Museum, which I did go to years ago, but years and years ago. But I went there because, of course, I have spent a lot of time. Hi, Justina. So the National Museum of Scotland, right here. I have spent a lot of time, of course, in Panama and South America, well, a lot of time in South America and Central America and so forth. But the history of this country is deeply tied and related to a small area in Panama, hence the title of this conversation, which is called the Darien Gap. Now, the Darien Gap is the land of the Kuna or Guna people, and they've lived there quite successfully for thousands of years. One must take note of that fact. But how does Scotland have a relationship with that? And really, how does that result in the end of Scottish independence? Now, for again, my historian friends and tour guide friends up here, there's so much to talk about. And in 1603, of course, you had the Union of the Crown. King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, and really right through the 1600s, you have so many wars, including the English Civil Wars, and Cromwell, who, as we all know, did devastating things, particularly in Ireland. So all that noted, the first governor of the Bank of England was a man named William Paterson. And so, I mean, already that's important. And if you see the old British banknotes, but it was the Bank of England. Well, he came up with a scheme. He had heard a story about this area, Portobello, and I didn't put the link in the description, but I do have a virtual tour, I think, or actually a video I did on YouTube about Portobello, which is in Panama today. It's on the Caribbean side. That was Columbus's third voyage across. Much warmer than this place, I can tell you. So between Portobello and Cartagena, which is now Colombia, is that Darien Gap. Basically, it's a bit tighter than that. And there's the San Blas Islands in there. You know, dramatically beautiful part of the world, but also, would you like that? Yeah, I'm gonna get some made up. But all that noted, that area is dense jungle. It's actually a terrible, terrible place these days of human trafficking and smuggling. Not the San Blas Islands, they're gorgeous, but the Darien, there's no road. It's the only reason you can't drive from the top of Tuktoyaktuk in the top of the Northwest Territories all the way down to Ushuaia. The only block in it is that kind of, I don't know what it is, about 100 kilometers, 60 miles of land between the two. So Patterson came up with this brilliant idea that all the trade would be controlled by whoever set up a fort at the narrowest part of the isthmus. And of course, Panama is an isthmus country. No, Panama doesn't become independent until 1802. Here, I'll turn this around so you don't have to just stare at me. But they come up with this brilliant idea. There were no bites in England, but he was a Scot, even though he was the head of the Bank of England. He comes up to Scotland, and Scotland was really desperately poor in the 1690s, 1695, between civil wars, and not the start of the clearances yet. That comes into the story a little later. But he says it is time for Scotland to have a colonial presence, right? And to have a colonial presence was really the idea of empire, and it was, once again, the Atlantic triangular trade. Think about that. You leave England or Portugal or Spain or France, you go down to Africa and you buy human beings. And so often people seem to retort, they say, well, they were being sold by other Africans. Perhaps, but the chattel trafficking of humanity is as horrible a crime as humanity has ever committed. So let's just all agree on that. There's no debate on that. There's I don't know if that's some kind of a restaurant up in that double-decker bus. It's sort of fun. So Scotland wanted to get in on it, and Scotland wanted to get in on the trade, but they start the idea of what was called the Darien Scheme. And Paterson sold this idea to the Scots, and the Scots thought it was a brilliant idea. By the way, it is so desperately foggy today, and I know I was asked to go up into the old town, but last time I tried to do something, it cut out there. Sorry, there's going to be some construction. I'm just coming up to the pedestrianized Rose Street, which is fun. Oh, and there's a bride. There's a bride and groom, I take it. Oh well, it's teach their own. No, it's lovely. Do you know what, everyone? That's the Scott Memorial down there. But because of all this construction, I'm going to just go down one more street just to get away from the racket. But I will try and take you down and give you some views. But I'll take you down Rose Street right now. Yeah, I heard it's bright and sunny everywhere else. The fog was meant to burn off by noon, and it's 3 o'clock and it hasn't. But hey, you know, that's the way weather goes sometimes. But just coming back to this really significant story. So they literally go out. Some English originally invested in it, but they were worried that the Scottish company, so the Scottish company trading in Africa and the Indies, it was what it was called, and they went out to finance it, but they already had these British colonial companies like the East India Company and so forth. So they banned it and they didn't let any English hold stock in it. But something like a third of all Scots invested their life savings in it. Now, Scotland being quite poor at that point, when the company raised £400,000 at that time, that was something like a quarter to a third of all the liquid money in the country. So I went to see the Darien Chest today, which is where they literally kept the notes, which are like stocks and shares of that time. And so that's 1695. By 1698, 6 ships sail away from Scotland on July 4th, and they arrive down to Panama November 2nd, I want to say. Only 91 people died on the way down, which actually in that day and age was considered quite good. That's how awful it was. You know, you might remember if you joined me on the trip or the tour that I did in Cartagena in Colombia, we talked about the fact that when you had these naval battles during that colonial period, sorry, there's another noisy vehicle. But when you had these colonial battles back then, you would actually count on half of your soldiers dying from disease rather than dying from battle and war. So just take that in. But they take all this money down there, and of course there's no communication, so nobody knows what's happening. But they wedge themselves, they arrive in Darien, and they wedge themselves in between the Spanish, right, the New World of Granada, and of course they had passed Jamaica on the way down, and Jamaica was the center, of course, of British buccaneers. Haiti was the center of the French. That was the legalized piracy that defined so much of Caribbean history. All right, so I just want to get this vehicle past us and then get around. I just love Edinburgh. I think it's such an interesting, beautiful city, and I don't feel like I'm showing you the best of it at the moment, but there are nice pubs around at least. So they go and establish themselves, and then a whole lot of terrible things happen. They start to, oh, good morning, Karen. They start to build this colony, but they don't really know what they're doing. They're coming from, of course, this cold northern country, and they've arrived. And I have been in the Darien Gap in my life. I didn't cross it because no one would help me across, but I have been in it, and I've met people who have been trafficked through it. So it's a place, academically, it plays a huge role in my life, which is why I've always wanted to go see more about the Darien scheme from this side. So they arrive at these 6 ships, and they get down there, and they start to build their colonial headquarters to try and control trade across Darien. But immediately, people start to expire, up to 10 a day. I even read 15 a day at one point, all from what we now discover to be malaria, but yellow fever. Yellow fever, of course, is what cost 21,000 lives of French subjects at their first attempt to try and build the Panama Canal. See, everybody knew for 500 years or 400 and something years that Panama would be the connection across the 2 oceans, which wiped out trade elsewhere in South America, well, and places like even Winnipeg. So, I mean, it's a fascinating bit of history. So they are expiring en masse. They didn't take a lot of arms with them, but they took a lot of things like mirrors and hairbrushes, which they thought they would be able to trade with the indigenous people. Hi, Charles. But, of course, the Kuna, who were doing just fine, didn't particularly want any of that stuff. So I'll try and get up and give you some views, but it's such a foggy day. It's not going to be that successful. See the big crowds of people heading around on a Friday afternoon. And so as they're expiring, then the Spanish come and attack. And, to be fair, well, there's no fair or unfair, but the Scots managed to repel them once, but they couldn't do it continuously. And in fact, the elite from the 6 ships went back to the ships themselves, living on there, because they didn't know why everyone was dying, but they were all dying from disease. So they go back to the ships. Eventually, the Spanish kicked them out, and actually, both times, let them leave without imprisoning them all. They did take one ship. So the Scots, already losing, of course, all the money from this whole scheme, sail up to Jamaica, where they're not allowed to land because they're not allowed to trade with any of the English colonies. This is where you get some of that deep tension with the English as well. So, or with, between England and Scotland that way. So that becomes that great failure. They leave, some of them ended up all the way up in what's now the United States. But as they leave with these ships, then at the other end, another load, so that it was 1,200 people went on the first one, another 4 ships come with 1,300 people. By the way, have a look at this floral clock since 1903. How beautiful is that? They come the other way, don't see each other. They go and try and reestablish themselves in this New Caledonia. Remember the old Roman name for Scotland was Caledonia. And that, once again, is attacked by the Spanish and fails as well. So by the time they return here, have a look at this lovely floral clock here. So by the time they return to Scotland, I believe, gosh, I have to check again, 1 or 2 ships actually make it back, but 71% of the colonists perished during this endeavor, and at least half the money of the Scottish Trading Company is lost, and Scotland is effectively at that point bankrupted. And so once again, starting in the old town is up above us, by the way. This is how foggy it is. This is one of the 2 reasons I didn't try to do a tour up the old town today. But if it clears up. Hi Lucy. Yes, Lucy just put, oh my God, yeah. I mean, the history of it. And we can tell these colonial stories all around the world. But of course, I'm in Scotland, and this is just fundamental to the history of Scotland. And I don't know how much it's taught here. It's certainly talked about in the museum more than it had been historically. Look at all these beautiful flowers everywhere. And so, as they make their way, so Scotland is effectively bankrupted. The scheme falls apart almost entirely. And they start to pass the Articles for Union, which is the idea of uniting Great Britain into a single country when it was already sharing a crown, on and off, but sharing a crown. Oh yeah, I mean, the stories are incredible. This, by the way, is once upon a time, the reason they built a new town is this lovely little valley here used to be the standing water of all the filth from the old town before there was any plumbing. And so if it clears up during our time together, I'll show it to you a bit more. So Justine's just asking if they traded in enslaved people. Yes, but the actual Scottish company failed. It failed so much that when the move towards the Act of Union comes about, it's debated within the Scottish Parliament, which was quite disempowered by then. The English Parliament was holding a lot more of the levers, but really there was a deal. Now remember, they had £400,000, lost most of it, which is something like $430 million in today's money or something. A small population, Scotland would have been under 1 million at that time. And England was much more like 10 or 11 million people. And so they offered mostly to the Scottish elite £398,000. There's the castle, just the silhouette of the castle in the extinct volcano up there on the hill. So they offer that. Well, the poor people of Scotland, so remember, most families, if they had anything, £10 to their name, they invested in the scheme. So the Act of Union happens, the Scottish Parliament is effectively closed down. Here's the origin of the rock. We talk so much about this old volcano, and here it is. So we talk about the whole thing being closed down. The Parliament is closed down, which is true. And so suddenly Great Britain, as we know it today, and that's where the Union flag comes about, the Scottish flag and the English flag are put together in a union. And so, to the very important question about trading in slaves, of course, it was the Portuguese that started that, and they were the last to end it. So that's another bit of history I'll have to do when I take my next trip to Portugal. But basically, the Scots become the working class of the British Empire in so many ways. And there are a disproportionate number of monuments throughout the city and this country to Scots who died keeping places British. In fact, up at the castle, just behind scaffolding, I wanted to get a photo, but when I was here in June, they were building scaffolding for the tattoo, and they just take you down. There's this big Celtic cross, but it is to, I want to say 5,000 Scots. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you very much for the contribution. But 5,000 Scots who died keeping India British. So just just keep that in mind and there's monuments all over. I mean, there's another monument that I pointed out to my group the other day, of so many Scots who died in South Africa, right? I mean, one war after another. So often, because of the mass poverty you had up here, a few things happened. You had obviously the Jacobite uprising, where we need to find someone. I need to give a gimbal to someone up in Inverness, or I need to go up to Culloden and talk about that. That was the attempt to restore, of course, the Catholic Stuart dynasty, which fails. And then, of course, the mighty clearances that go from, it looks like a palm tree. It is technically not a palm tree. I cannot remember the name of what it is, but it looks very much like a palm tree, but it's technically not. But you see them down the west of Ireland as well. So they start clearing the people off the highlands. Now just think about this for a second. They burnt people's roofs. These are as poor as the west of Ireland was, of course, during the Great Hunger. This is previous to the Great Hunger. This is why, of a country of 5 million people, there's 25 or 27 million people around the world with Scottish heritage. They had to leave. But up in the Highlands, sheep and wool were worth more money than humans. And so they burnt their houses and said, get out. Now, where do many of them go? Well, they go to New Scotland, Nova Scotia. Many went to Canada. Many end up in the I've got to show you a couple other things here, but many end up in the Hudson's Bay Company, particularly Orkney people from the north, because they were considered so tough. And one of those names, one of the really important names from the Western Isles of Scotland, was MacLeod. And if you've ever seen a tour with me in Calgary, you've seen Colonel MacLeod, right? So there was all of that. But there's just so much more around here. But this is what I mean throughout this country. The Call 1914, a tribute from men and women of Scottish blood and sympathies in the United States, America to Scotland. Not amazing, but of course, World War I. Once again, disproportionate number of Scots die. And of course, for my Irish friends on board, we all know so many Irish perish, fighting for empire. And that leads, of course, directly to Irish independence as well. Your mother's maiden name is MacLeod. Paula, maybe you told me that before. Sorry, I try and repeat questions because they don't see them on the replay. Here is the Falklands Memorial Gardens, or as some of us would maybe call them, the Las Malvinas. But that's another story. But yeah, so much. So in Scotland then, after the clearances, so much of the shipbuilding and everything of empire builds up around Glasgow. Now, what happens in Edinburgh here? Edinburgh becomes a huge center of learning. And so another, and I guess a slightly more positive contribution from a Scottish point of view, is some of the earliest and best medical research, scientific, it was all Scottish. So Edinburgh becomes this incredible center of learning. At one point, there were 4 universities here, including St. Andrews, the old course, the kind of birth of golf, although there was a golf course here earlier than that. But Glasgow becomes really the most industrial of the cities here on this island of Great Britain. And it was interesting when they were talking about it up in the museum today. They were describing it. So Scotland goes from 1.3 million people at the start of the 1800s up to about 3.5 million by the 1870s. That's huge growth, and it's almost all urban. So what was a rural and quite vast country becomes densely urban through what they call here the Central Belt. And Glasgow on the Clyde River becomes this powerful industrial Victorian center. But when I say that, the description of the conditions were just so awful, where something like half the population lived in one-room buildings without plumbing or heat or anything, right? So you can see where, early Glasgow didn't even want the Act of Union. So that's just powerful history to climb into. It's lovely being down here. I'm hoping the castle is going to clear up a little bit. So, in short order, that's sort of the story of the Darien scheme. And from that period, from the failure of that in, call it, 1700, that fails. Then, of course, they build a train across, but the French set out, I just have to remember his name now, the fellow who built, the Suez Canal goes over. And of course, when we talk about It does feel atmospheric. But the 21 or 22,000 who died in the attempt to build a canal, literally they tried to blast the volcanic rock between the two oceans, which obviously, well, apparently wasn't going to work, and it didn't. They built, they were all dying thinking they were being bitten by ants, and so to prevent the ants getting near the tents, they put water around the tents, but it wasn't ants, it was yellow fever from mosquitoes. But many of those French who died were, of course, from those islands like Haiti and Martinique, where populations were upwards of 90% enslaved people, or I guess at that point, historically enslaved. You know, the French Empire ended enslavement first, but that was only to try and hang on to Haiti, which was the most valuable place in the world in the 18th century because of sugarcane. So we just have to be as honest about all of that as we possibly can. But so the birth of modern Scotland was really defined by that huge changeover when it was bankrupted and became part of very much that British Empire for another long period of time. So, you know, pretty significant. Now, it'd be really fun to walk the whole Royal Mile. Now have a look at this. During the war years, 1940 to 45, the Norwegian Brigade and other army units were raised and trained in Scotland. Here we found hospitality, friendship, and hope during dark years of exile. In grateful memory of our friends and allies on these isles, this stone was erected in the year 1978. So, you know, so much of the memory in this part of the world was World War II, and I think that's really significant. Now, modern Scotland, I'd like to say, in a reflective sense, you just see everywhere real honest attempts at inclusivity, like redoing the sign for Dundas there. I was up in one of the rooms, and of course there's even one display in the National Museum about Scots going to Canada, because of course Canada and Scotland have a deep history and relationship. I mean, you know, so many of the political leaders in Canada, including the first Prime Minister, who incidentally was not a nice man, were Scottish. But look at this gorgeous Victorian fountain there. But modern Scotland's really neat. And so they had one display, though, about the Tlingit First Nation. The Tlingit Nation signed a treaty with the British Columbia government in the late 90s. And they had a totem that was Tlingit, and they sent it back to them. So good on you, Scotland. You know, so often when we see these stories where, you know, the British Museum that sort of says, oh, you know, we can't send things back to Greece because they won't take care of them. You know, that's a tough one. There's clearly an attempt here in Scotland to make amends, and I think that's very important. You know, I have to say, I know people debate this. I'm a believer in taking down statues when someone's awful enough, but at the very least putting up plaques to have those conversations and making the plaques big enough and readable enough. And I did think that was you know, well done in the museum. And the museum is free. I mean, I made a donation, of course, but the museum is free, so you know, that's really fun. I'm always excited when I come to Edinburgh. It's such a beautiful city. It's just, I've had two trips this year to Scotland where last time I was out in Oban, of course, for a couple of days out on the west coast, which is just a wonderful place. And I have to say, I have only had one whiskey while I've been here. Is a beautiful town. And it was one of the gentlemen on my tour had, he wanted to try something different, so we tried one of the West Coast kind of smoke. No, that's not true. I had two, excuse me, because I did have one with Mike, who's a local guide that I've used twice now, and he's originally Canadian, but his family's all Scottish. So yeah, we actually had one. That's right. Yeah, it's true. Now I had a few pints, so I'm not pretending otherwise. So most of my group left today. I just got two people who haven't left just because of flights or whatever, but I'm going out sometime later today. I'm going to get in a cab or on a bus and go out and stay at the airport, and then I fly to Toronto tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and then back home to Calgary. And then, incidentally, 2 days later, I am meeting a group of French Canadians for a tour in the west of Canada. The only thing is we've had to change the itinerary because we are not going to Jasper, needless to say, which is heart-wrenching for anyone from my part of the world. And, you know, I think of old Jasper House, which is 1811, and as well. I mean, so many of the traders there were either French Canadian or Scottish, of course, and the Northwest Company was mostly Scottish owned. And so the old money of Canada, the Golden Square Mile up there in central Montreal, where the first plumbing was in North America, that was all Scottish money and Scottish success in Canada, but in many cases on the backs of the Indigenous population. So another important thing to talk about. So here we are at the parish church of St. Cuthbert. Do you know, now that I think about it, I remember going to school with people with the surname Cuthbert. So many Scottish connections. I do have on one side, I have a bit of Scottish heritage, which is pretty typical if you're from anywhere in the west of Canada. Well, you know, there's so much talk about these thistles. But as someone said, you know, when your national animal is a unicorn, you got to be a bit of a dreamer, right? So I do like the fact that they have the unicorn as a national animal, and there's some lovely statues, and I mean, there's really lots of them around. But I thought I would get better reception here, and on a foggy day, sometimes I lose the reception anyway. So it's pretty lucky to be able to come out and show this and talk about it. Feel free to share this video, of course, but if you go back and look at my Portobello video, that is where the Spanish exported so much of the wealth from South America. By the time the Scots were going down to the Caribbean side, that's where the Darien scheme was, New Caledonia, but it's okay. But by the time they went down there, they were actually more interested in shipping goods from the Caribbean side over to the other side, because the ships had to go all the way around the bottom of the Cape, which is why cities like Punta Arenas, Ushuaia, and Valparaiso, all in Chile, had taken off all of that. So the Scots, like everyone else, knew there would be another route, and Panama was always going to be that route. And then of course, the Americans did it, but that was still like another 10,000 lives to build that. So I will, incidentally, I've got a tour in Costa Rica and Nicaragua in November. We still have 5 spaces left on that one. And I know some people even on board here are planning on coming to Oaxaca in Mexico in January. So I'll have details of that one very soon. But I'm very, very busy the next little while. I had 2 months at home. But yeah, I'll get home tomorrow. I start on tour on Monday, literally Monday at noon in Calgary. I'll end up in Vancouver, come home, and then I have a whole Welsh group coming to Banff for a few days. And then I'm going to Cape Cod, which is going to be a very relaxing and discovery trip. So lots to look forward to. And then I'm off to Japan. And I will definitely do some virtual tours in Japan. Most of the places on the trip I've been to before. So you're very welcome. It's my pleasure. I want to thank everyone for, of course, their support. When you can make a donation, it's much appreciated. It really goes. Generally, my donations these days are going to different charities and that sort of thing. I just want to show you this Celtic cross. I did spend a lot of time in the museum on the Reformation, some of that history in Scotland, which I didn't know as much about. What a beautiful cross, though, there, hey? Well, Cape Cod is just gorgeous, and it's a lovely time here because it's not too busy. Hey, this is a good example, by the way, of... Well, thank you, Lucy. This is a good example of this kind of modern Scotland, which I think is just so much nicer a place to be than back when it was all about serving an empire. I think we can all agree on that. I'd love to see a lot more of this education in Europe and places like France and Portugal and so forth. So I think that's an important thing. And even though it's not that exciting on a live tour, you might see McDonald's over there, right? Obviously famous Scottish restaurant. But beside it is Jollibee. And I still haven't eaten at Jollibee, but I need to because that is a Filipino chain. There's Filipino food. And of course, where I live, we have a really huge Filipino population. Oh, look at that. Richard Pauly is here, everyone. Sorry, I didn't even see you here. Richard Pauly, if you don't know him, you should know him, is my very, very dear friend who's a licensed Blue Badge guide in London. I actually stayed at Richard's house during this trip when we were in London. Because this was sirens. This was a small family group. I had 9 people on the trip. And so, sorry. I think something's on fire. Look at that. It's not that, I mean, I have so much respect for firefighters and everything, but, you know, compared to at home, there's so little wood here. It always amazes me. But yes, a big shout out to my friend Richard. If you are coming to London, please let me hook you up with Richard for a tour because, well, every group I have goes on tour with him. And I mean, I know London well, but I mean, he has spent years studying it. So that's really, really significant. And he's also just brilliant. And also, it's so nice to see Alison from the Highlands in some of these tours because Alison was the guide from my group last year up in Inverness. And not only was she brilliant, she also sang for them. So, Richard, you're going to have to start singing for your groups. I sing in French on my tours. Anyway, everyone, I just want to say that's so lovely to see all of you. Peace and love. And I've got articles. Well, you know, I have the coins. I talk a lot about the Darien scheme. I've wanted to do something, but I've always wanted to tie that dot. And I finally had the free time to do it. So, hey, big hugs. Lots of love, everyone. And I will see you. I'll put on some tours when I go west. I'll be in Golden. I'll be in Kamloops. I'll be in Vancouver as well. So, see you. Take care. All the very best, my friends. And I will talk to you as soon as possible. Bye-bye.